The Chernobyl disaster wasn't merely a technological failure, it was a cataclysm, an eruption of chaos that spewed deadly radiation across borders, with consequences that would echo through generations. But imagine if it had been even worse. What if the radioactive core had continued to smolder, its deadly fumes spilling into the atmosphere unchecked? What if the very Earth itself had rebelled, swallowing the poisoned soil and spreading radiation far and wide, contaminating rivers, crops, and the entire ecosystem? In a timeline where Reactor 4 was not contained, the meltdown turned into an explosion of the entire site. Unimaginable in scope, the catastrophic explosion at Chernobyl did more than destroy lives and land. It forever altered the trajectory of the Soviet Union and the world. The cloud of radiation unleashed was far more extensive and enduring than initially imagined. Sweeping across the Soviet Union, the cloud spread over Eastern Europe, Scandinavia, and into parts of Western Europe, its invisible poison lingering for years. The area directly affected stretched from Ukraine to parts of Russia, Belarus, and Eastern Europe, covering a territory the size of modern-day France. Over time, the fallout drifted further, contaminating not just land, but rivers, lakes, and air. The immediate region around Chernobyl was rendered uninhabitable for centuries, but its reach extended well beyond the exclusion zone. Radioactive particles carried by winds fell with rain, seeping into the soil of Europe's breadbasket, affecting agriculture and food supplies across the continent. For Russia, the consequences were devastating. Already teetering on the edge of collapse, the Soviet Union's infrastructure was ill-equipped to handle a disaster of this magnitude. As radiation spread, panic consumed the nation. In the weeks and months following the explosion, tens of thousands fled major cities, only to find themselves in areas just as contaminated. The strain on the healthcare system was immediate and overwhelming. Hospitals filled with radiation victims, many of whom suffered from cancers, deformities, and genetic mutations. The psychological toll was equally crippling. Fear of radiation became a permanent shadow over the nation, as mistrust in the government and widespread hysteria took hold. Within what was left of the Soviet Union, chaos reigned. Economic collapse accelerated as key agricultural regions were rendered useless, and the vast sums needed to contain the disaster drained the nation's already faltering resources. Massive swathes of the Soviet heartland became wastelands, unusable for farming or industry. As Gorbachev's attempts at reform were undermined by hardliners desperate to cling to power, the republics within the Soviet Union began to splinter. Ukraine, Belarus, and others sought independence, blaming Moscow for the disaster and its deadly aftermath. By 1990, the Soviet Union was fractured beyond repair. Gorbachev, having survived several assassination attempts, was eventually ousted by a military coup. But the coup leaders faced an insurmountable challenge, a nation ravaged by internal dissent, environmental catastrophe, and a rebellion on multiple fronts. Civil wars erupted in Ukraine, Belarus, and the Caucasus, while the Baltics declared full independence and received covert support from NATO. In a desperate bid to retain control, Moscow declared martial law, but the internal collapse was unstoppable. By the mid-1990s, Russia had descended into a brutal civil conflict. Nationalist factions, Soviet loyalists, and regional militias fought for control of what was left of the shattered state. Entire cities were abandoned, and many parts of Russia became lawless, controlled by warlords and militias. The radioactive wastelands became both battlegrounds and places of refuge for those fleeing the chaos. By the time the conflict ended, Russia was no longer a superpower, but a fractured landmass, a patchwork of independent republics, rogue states, and devastated territory. The world had witnessed the implosion of one of the most powerful empires in history. But the disaster did not only affect Russia and the former Soviet Union. The radioactive cloud that had spread over Europe left an indelible mark on the continent's future. In Western Europe, governments scrambled to contain the effects of the fallout. In the years following the Chernobyl disaster, food shortages became rampant as contaminated crops were discarded en masse. The need for clean, safe energy became more urgent than ever. Nuclear power, once seen as the future, was now viewed as a horror waiting to happen. nations across Europe turned to alternative energy sources, fast-tracking the development of wind, solar, and hydropower. By the early 21st century, Europe had transitioned almost entirely away from nuclear energy, investing heavily in green technology. The disaster also profoundly altered the trajectory of global superpowers. The United States, having watched the Soviet Union disintegrate, seized the opportunity to cement its position as the world's dominant power. However, the environmental and humanitarian crisis in Europe forced the US to rethink its own energy policies. The push for renewable energy in Europe spurred technological competition, and by the 2020 USSR, both Europe and the US had developed advanced, highly efficient renewable energy grids. Technological innovation accelerated as green technology became the new arms race. China, too, took note of the fallout from Chernobyl. Seeing how nuclear disaster had crippled a global superpower, the Chinese government adopted a cautious approach to its own nuclear energy program. Instead, China became a leader in solar and wind energy production, investing heavily in renewable infrastructure and exporting its technology around the globe. By the time the 21st century dawned, the world had changed irrevocably. The scars of Chernobyl remained. Large swathes of Eastern Europe and Russia remained off-limits, ghostly reminders of the disaster. In the regions hardest hit by the radiation, birth defects and cancer rates skyrocketed for decades, creating a generation of people whose lives were marked by the invisible killer. In Russia, the once united federation had splintered into a collection of weak, independent states. Moscow, once the heart of a superpower, was now a shadow of its former self, a regional player struggling to manage its internal divisions. Yet, even as Russia fell from the ranks of global powers, the world had moved on. In Europe, the devastation caused by the fallout had birthed a new era of innovation. The continent became the global leader in renewable energy, with companies like Tesla and Siemens pioneering advancements in clean technology. Global politics, too, had shifted. Without a powerful Russia, Eastern Europe became a battleground for influence between a resurgent NATO and a cautiously expanding China. By 2050, the world was a place where the lessons of Chernobyl echoed in every corner. The disaster had left an indelible mark on the human psyche, forever changing how nations approached energy, technology, and even war. The collapse of the Soviet Union had paved the way for new alliances, new technologies, and new fears. But one thing remained clear. The shadow of Chernobyl would never fully fade, a haunting reminder of humanity's capacity for both destruction and resilience. So, what do you think? If the Chernobyl disaster had spiraled into an even greater catastrophe, how different would our world be today? Could Russia have survived, or would Europe have been forever changed? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below. And if you enjoyed this deep dive into an alternative history, be sure to hit that like button and subscribe for more intriguing scenarios. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you in the next video.